My name is Sebastian Maslow. I have the pleasure to co-convene this event today. Before I start, I would like to thank all of you for the effort of coming up to Tohoku to Sendai for this occasion. We are very pleased to host this event with the kind support of the Tohoku Forum for Creativity here at Tohoku University. I should give you a small introduction to the program itself before we start. So the initial idea of this conference, I think it was 2 years ago, almost 2 years, together with my colleague Chris Wirth and our other two co-conveners, Dr. O'Shea and Dr. Mason. And we all have a bit of a history with Tohoku University. We all studied here at Tohoku University in the past, and we all met here, and we somehow remained related to this university. So despite the fact that we all are teaching and working somewhere else now, but we'd like to come back. And so we applied for the funding and are very pleased to welcome you all here in Sendai for this 2-day event. The idea for this roundtable is since this is, I suppose, the first time, many of you know each other on a bilateral basis, but I think it's the first time that you all have met in a group. So the idea is to warm up a bit for tomorrow's workshop, to give you a chance to introduce your own work, to chat, to interact. So we thought a roundtable would be a good idea to facilitate the discussion. And so we have a stage setting, so there's only a limited space for a limited number of chairs. So we have 6 people on the stage, but this does not mean that the 6 people have to talk. So it's a round table. So we invite the audience to participate here in the debate. So before we start the round table, let me just give you a small introduction to the topic. I have to say, this is my first conference I convene, so if anything doesn't go as smooth as you may anticipate, so this is due to my lack of experience, so I apologize in advance. Anyway, so perhaps more than anything else, last year's elections have illustrated the relevance of this roundtable, if not the project. So Prime Minister Abe Shinzo has dissolved the Diet, declaring his decision necessary to break through the national crisis of Japan. Hence, his terming elections, he has termed the elections Kokunan Toppa Kaisan. So what crisis does he refer to if he says Kokunan Toppa Kaisan? A security crisis, a demographic crisis, an economic crisis, a welfare state crisis, or all of them. So I think for those of you who reside in Japan, last year's best-selling book by Kawai Masashi was entitled Mirai no Nenpyo, and it provides a detailed timeline for the results of Japan's democratic crisis. He says by 2024, 1 of 3 people will be over 65. By 2033, one out of 3 houses in Japan will be empty, an Akiya. By 2014, half of Japan's municipalities will disappear. So this is a very precise timeline for the crisis that Japan is facing. So how is Japan dealing with this set of crises? The current political discourse has pledged to take Japan back and announce the rebirth of the nation. That is what the Prime Minister says. Here, perceptions of Japan's decline and weakness are caused by the lost decades, and constraints are also caused by its post-war constitution. They have become a common reference point in the writing on Japan and political debate in Japan. Also, as I'm sure you are aware, we are marking the 7th anniversary of the 3/11 triple disaster. For many, 3/11 triggered hope to resolve Japan's political and economic crisis immediately after the event. However, as the call for change was soon replaced by the demand for recovery, state crisis management was framed as government failure, and it brought eventually back the old elites into power. So in light of an entrenched LDP dominance, we therefore consider it necessary to assess the claim that as Colin Hay, the father of this idea for this workshop, has argued, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And if maybe it's true, Japan might be a valuable case study. So then again, What is crisis? We, four of the conveners, and as if you have read in our introduction, we consider crisis as a political process, but also as a social experience. So crisis perception and crisis response are the result of narratives amplifying failure and seeking sites for reform. Crisis narratives thus forecast the direction of state transition and hence the future of Japan. So, bearing this definition of crisis in mind, I would like to set the table for the discussion today. During our first round, I would like you a set of questions. And before we do that, I invite our panelists, the four names on the list, on the stage, which is Professor Hiroko, I think, and Dr. O'Shea, and Professor Hasegawa, and Professor Takeda, if you would mind to come on the stage. So again, this is not a closed panel, so we will expand the discussion for all other participants. But again, as the setting sort of determines, it's a bit of a weird setting, but so we apologize. But please feel invited to participate in the discussion. So we have only one microphone, so I'll have to pass it on. The first question I would like, it's a very general question. So in all your fields of research, so what is crisis in your, from your perspective? How do you see the crisis discourse in contemporary Japan? And what are the causes for this crisis narratives in the fields that you're interested in? So I don't go with seniority, I just go in the sitting order. So I'll start with Professor Takeda, and I should introduce Professor Takeda before I actually do this. So she is a professor, as I'm sure you all know, of the University of Nagoya, Meidai, at the School of Law, the Hogakubu, and her expertise is gender politics, family, the politics of family in Japan, but she's also published a lot about food security and other related topics. So here we have the expert on gender politics in Japan, and I think the family. I think she will be very happy to talk about the implications of Abenomics, neoliberal reform, structural reform in Japan. So I think I'll start with you. And
thank you very much. So you said about 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay. Right. Okay. Nice to see you. I'm Hiroko Takeda from Nagoya University. Now, it was really nice to be here. And, I was so excited when I received the email from Christian because I mean, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons actually is Christian's email included reference to the Colin Hayes articles. And around that time, actually, I was writing about, in Japanese, Labour Party politics in Britain. And so, like a Colin Hayes articles are quite important sort of, like an information source for me. And also at that time, I was thinking about this crisis of winter of discontent, like Hay uses as a case study. And so I was thinking around that time and still thinking about it. And so, perhaps allow me to sort of make reference to the winter of discontent. I think there are some sort of critical qualitative and important differences actually between what's actually going on in UK at that time in 1970s and today's situation, particularly sort of considering the Abe government sort of naming decline, birth rate decline as something like a national crisis. It's actually in a policy document. It is officially called birth rate decline is a national crisis. But I don't think so, to be honest. And it is actually sort of naming and coding, and it is something, we need to sort of associate with the concept of moral panic. It's more like, someone, agent, try to sort of enhance and stimulate the sense of fear, sense of, disgusting. So And it's so basically, I mean, to me, it's what happening in Japan is more like a political act to define birth rate decline. Yeah, something actually kind of like we need to blame. And like when we blame, we have someone to be blamed, and someone to be blamed, in many cases, basically young women. There's a few reasons for that, but basically, I think I think two important differences. The winter of discontent. That was actually sort of crisis making by oppositions at that time. Opposition Tory party tried to sort of erode legitimacy of basically the Labour Party as a governing party. And so it was basically attempt by Tory to sort of build hegemony building. But here, what's going on is actually, particularly in with reference to the sort of birth rate decline, the policy making elite, the establishment, like calling something, like the crisis. So basically, political sort of, like a direction is opposite. And so in a sense, like what's happening to me is basically, policy making elite called, birth rate decline as a national crisis. In so doing, basically try to sort of maintain the status quo of basically, like a national economy based on basically the middle class family life. So that's one point. So I don't think, it is actually, it should be called a crisis, more like a moral panic caused by the state. And the second sort of important point is, like basically, I think we have a gap between the perception of policymaking elite, the establishment, and basically young women. So, the birth rate decline is an aggregated phenomenon. And at the individual level, basically what's going on is, very rational behavior of family planning. People face, like, their realities, like doing some calculations, cost-benefit calculation, like economy calculation, of course, emotional, social calculation, and try to basically decide whether or not they have a baby. So that's a rational act. But this rational act gets aggregated at the national level, and it appears as birth rate decline. So it's a fallacy of composition. So from the policymaker's perspective, it's a crisis. But like as family planning, as I discuss in my book, it's a kind of modus operandi of Japanese society since 1950s. It is not crisis. But policy-making elite need to call it a crisis because basically they have really difficult job to reverse the trend of birth rate. That basically, like it's very difficult to persuade somebody who would like to have a family or have a baby to do otherwise. So, here basically I find basically this moral, basically moral panic caused by state is ongoing in Japan.
I think the way I should do it, I should have done it the other way. I should have first introduced all our panelists before giving the mic away. So our next panelist is Professor Hasegawa Koichi, who is a sociologist here at Tokyo University, one of our most famous professors in the department. And he's very renowned for his work on social movements, particularly the movement against the anti-nuclear movement. Here we go, beyond Fukushima. And so he was a very outspoken scholar after the 3/11 disaster. And the irony is that Professor Hasegawa has written about nuclear energy already very extensively in the 90s when he was in the United States doing field work there. And this research became very actual after the disaster. So here we have one of our most known scholars on the social movement and civil society in Japan who's very familiar with this topic. Our next panelist is Professor Kiyawaki from the University of Zurich, chair of social science in Japan. His work is focused on inequality in Japan, the social models of inequality, and the transition of those concepts from the middle class to the divided society, It's another, I think, a major research field is Japan's immigration policy, which I think is one of his books that he has published, which will also play into the topic of this, I think, of this project. And our last panelist is Dr. O'Shea, who's currently an associate professor at the University of Lund, senior lecturer. Is it? Associate senior lecturer. It's Sweden, so it's not so clear. So he has again, he is part of our organization group here. He has spent some time here at Tokyo University. He has written his PhD on Japan's territorial disputes. I think he's broadened his research agenda. He's now doing work on food security and other risk communication and other topics. I think that should give you an idea of who you're facing here on the panel. So I'll give the mic to Professor Hasegawa there with the same set of questions.
Okay. Today's title of this round table, Japan as number 3. I'd like to confirm what is mean Japan as number 3. Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump, and Shinzo? No. Sebastian's question, what is crisis? But imagine if Shinzo Abe is here, what he speak? Yeah, I imagine immediately he will deny the crisis because he already is running his cabinet more than 5 years. In Japanese context, running cabinet 5 years is very tremendous. And he won 5 national elections. Very successful. And ruling party keeping 2 thirds lower house seats. Yeah. So Shinzo Abe will show some indexes how he is successful, like Donald Trump. Yeah. So the definition is what is crisis. Of course, it depends on political, social position. And my special field, social movement and environmental issues, and especially after 3/11's disaster. Especially recently, in my impression, the crisis is hidden. The crisis is unseen, or the crisis is hard to be observed. So, in my class, this class was closed in last January. After general election in October, I gave a questionnaire to my students. They are mainly second-year students of Bungakubu, Arts and Letters. the title is it's a general course of sociology. Okay, maybe just 80 students. I was very surprised. This class started from early October, and at first I introduced my political position. My position is very liberal. So if you don't like to the position of liberal, keep remember my political position. I said, but after general election, I gave a questionnaire, and they returned. I requested to reply without name. So, animated questionnaire survey. I was very surprised. Many students support Abe cabinet and LDP. Very few support Japan Communist Party. So recently, a younger generation is main support base of Abe cabinet and LDP. And 50s and 60s generation are most critical to Abe and LDP. So, younger generations' social position is not so good. They have a lot of problem in the future. Nevertheless, they are the mostly support to Abe. So this is a kind of paradox. And as you know, tomorrow I'd like to speak about the situation in 2012 and 2015. Yeah, at the time, some anti-Abe, no, at the time, anti-Noda, and 2012 summer, and 2015 autumn, yeah, anti-Abe campaign was very aggressive. Nevertheless, such a anti-Abe campaign was relatively silent in these days. Yeah. So, what is the reason? Yeah. Yeah. Some people, yeah, like Sebastian, yeah, and our social sciences like Canaria in mining. Yeah. So we are very sensitive to coming crisis, but ordinary citizens and especially younger generation are not so sensitive to real crisis. Yeah, this is a real crisis, I think. Thank you.
So I take over directly the microphone. I was thinking maybe as an introduction statement to put a little bit Japan and the question of inequality more in the, let's say, global perspective in sociology and research on inequality. Because obviously we have not only Japan where we have this debate on inequality, but it's a general debate in sociology or in social science on the rising inequality and we could say the political impact. And because obviously starting with Donald Trump and the angry white man who put him in power, to the rise of populist parties in Europe, etc., there's a kind of a feeling that inequality is increasing. More and more people feel no longer, let's say at least to the same degree, integrated into society and into economic growth of the society or future development of the society. And that this leads to a destabilization of politics or the political system, of the rise of new parties, of new types of politicians, of populism, etc. And obviously, sociological research shows, yes, we have an increase of inequality, actually something that started in the advanced industrial societies in the mid-70s, so it's something going on for a long time. And yes, we have surely a feeling of crisis in several societies, or we could say a feeling of that we're going beyond mass production, we could call it Fordistic society, of integration of large shares of the population into societies where it's no longer you have to the same degree sure careers, secure employment, etc. And if we take this, of course, in comparison Japan, then we could say, yes, Japan has also this trend. But overall, we need to say Japan is still very stable. I mean, it's always a question with what you compare it. Like if you compare it with Italy, for example, 20, 30% youth unemployment. People would be happy to have an atypical employment, what is normally the kind of the crisis discourse you have in youth employment in Japan, that people have no longer secure full-time employment. In Italy, they don't have anything at all. Of course, there you have more informal economy. You always had more informal economy, so the problem may be not so big as the statistic tells us, but still you see a completely different, let's say, degree of crisis. What we could also say maybe on a second level, if we look on more now concretely sociology, I would say maybe we have also a crisis of sociology or of structural explanation of change. I remember my introduction lesson to sociology many years ago in Zurich, at the Zurich University, and at the time our professor Hoffmann Nowotny, he said to us, "You guys are studying the wrong thing in Switzerland. You should all study psychology. Psychology is the future." Because in Switzerland we all believe to have the best political system of the world with direct democracy, which means that if anybody has a problem with political or economically, he can start the political process to change society. So we all think we have the best structural society with the best structures. And if you have a problem, it's not a problem due to structures, it's your personal problem. So you need a psychologist. That's why psychology is so important in Switzerland and sociology is very unimportant. So. And to a certain degree, I would say we have a kind of a Helvetization of the world, of industrial societies. Psychology has become much more important in recent years, explaining problems through, it's a personal problem of the individual. You could also call it individualization of crisis. I don't have a crisis because the structures are not functioning, what maybe would have been the story in the 60s and 70s, but it's my personal, I have to advance to get better, etc. I have to manage myself, I don't have to change the society. So there we could also say we have maybe some kind also a disbelief in the ability to change structures and even a narrative, a meta-narrative somehow, that crises and problems are not so much on the structural level, but more on the individual level. And I think to a certain degree we could also say this about Japan, that we have also this development. If you look on the big crisis stories, they are more taking place on the individual level. However, of course, we have this story also of the Kakusashakai, so of the increase in inequality. And maybe the other interesting thing is, as I said, I think there is not a fundamental change, although this is actually a narrative, you could say, Kakusashakai, who speaks of a fundamental change, of a change from a general middle-class societies up to the late 1990s, and then kind of a transformation into a gap society with much more social inequality, with social exclusion, with kind of a bifurcation of society into winners and losers, etc. But I think, of course, this is too simple, or it's not backed up with data, if you look at it. Already before Japan was obviously a society with social inequality, not everybody was middle class. There was always a working class in Japan, and not everybody in the working class was included. There were always poor people or relatively poor families, children from relatively poor families with much lower life chances, etc., etc. There has been also some increase, but not a fundamental transformation. So then the question is, of course, okay, what happened there? This is a question of sociology of knowledge. Why do we have a narrative who all of a sudden is so successful, has such a huge resonance in the population, becomes kind of dominant model? Today, I would say, generally say in Japan, the model is gap society. It's no longer general middle class society. And I would say the important thing maybe what happened is that we really had, especially in Japan, a kind of a shared growth up to the 1990s. So we had a strong growth economically, which generally led to growth in nearly all households, more income, more purchasing power. We had also social upward mobility through the generations in Japan. And this reached to some point an end in the late 1990s. And I think this is also something we see in other Western societies. And this means also why we have this crisis discourse to a certain degree, or why it has this resonance, because it reaches really the core of society, the middle classes, the foundation. Those who had before the secure life courses and could be kind of be sure that their kids would have the same or even better life courses, that may not be to the same degree the case today. So there is maybe really a structural transformation in the everyday life shows in the people, and especially in the middle classes here. And I think this is especially the case in Japan, because Japan somehow didn't have a problem in many Western industrial societies. The problem starts already in the 1970s with oil shock, increasing inflation, increasing unemployment. Japan doesn't have this problem. The party goes on, so you could say, in Japan. But it comes to a very sudden end in the late 1990s and starts to result in these crises. What is maybe interesting in the case in Japan, the last word, is the political impact. What we actually see in Japan, I think, we have kind of political entrepreneurs who use these new narratives of crisis, also of social inequality, or of non-shared growth, if you want. But if we look who were the most successful entrepreneurs in Japan in recent years, I would say Koizumi, 2005, with the postal reformation, neoliberal model, so to say. Then Ozawa, who turns around the DPJ from a pro-reform party into a party who will re-establish social inequality, kind of a social democrat, so to say. And the third one is, of course, Abe with the Abenomics, kind of, I will bring back growth without having to go through the very painful structural reforms, so to say, because the main problem is actually the finance policy, so to say. An interesting thing is here to see is, obviously, these are three politicians who come out of the conservative establishment. So we could maybe go back to the idea of T.G. Pemple and say we have still the creative conservatives in Japan who use these narratives of crisis, of social inequality, and of non-shared growth, if you allow me to call it this way, and very successfully then win elections with their narratives, their interpretation of the structural change going in. Okay, so much from my side.
So, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm going to make a few sort of random points, I guess. I'm not sure if there's a thread between them, but then tomorrow we can see if we can make, that's why we're here anyway. So when I was asked to think about crisis and what it means, well, I confess I didn't start doing that until this week, when I was already here, actually. And it struck me that when I was on the Narita Express, I was warned that Japan was on high alert. And I thought, oh yeah, every time I've ever taken the Narita Express, Japan has been on high alert. And when I came here first, and I came here actually probably quite late, I came to Japan quite late perhaps in comparison to some of you. My first visit to Japan was in 2007. Japan was on high alert. And I remember I was on the JET program as an English teacher, and I used my opportunity to get out into the countryside and be a tourist as much as possible. And I remember being at bus stops in the back forest of Okayama and seeing these terror warning signs. And being a naive, innocent English teacher, I thought, Islamic terrorism? Is Japan worried about Islamic terrorism? Why are there terror warning signs in the backcountry of Okayama? So there's been building towards some kind of national security crisis for as long as I've known Japan. And another thing I did actually this week was I emailed a friend who lives in Seoul, and I asked him what it was like in Seoul at the moment. And the reason I did that was because I saw the homepage of Tohoku University. Somebody actually sent me the homepage of Tohoku University and pointed out that there was a section warning international students. Sebastian, I hope you don't mind me telling that this was you. Warning international students on the front page, big thing, warning you what to do in the event of a missile attack. And so I asked my friend in Seoul, I said, so what's different over there, that place where actually there are hundreds of artillery weapons pointing directly at and which will be turned into toast the moment something happens in the case of a conflict? He said, oh, so more or less the same, business as usual. And it's like, okay, yeah. So I guess, we want to wonder, why is the North Korea? I mean, perhaps I'm treading old ground for many of you. Many of you kind of already have an answer to these questions in your head. I know some of you have done research on the topic and know much more than me, but just for the sake of making a few early points, why is North Korea such a deal here and not such a deal in South Korea? Why are the South and the North making joint flags and joint teams for the Olympics, while Abe is encouraging the United States to put on as much pressure as possible? Last year, for example, in April, Japan issued a travel warning for its citizens to go to South Korea, and it's the only country that did that. So crisis is it's a very important thing, as we've heard. Crises are very useful things. But what crisis? I mean, if Trump does launch a limited strike on North Korea, then there is a massive crisis. Whether you want to talk about subjectivity or objectivity, we can just say there is a massive crisis. And Abe is depicted as being very strong for Japan's national security. He's done a lot. He's been successful. He's strengthened the US-Japan alliance. He's formed a close relationship with Donald Trump. He gave him that lovely golf club when he went to Trump Towers, even while Obama was still in the White House. So yes, the mainstream story is that Abe-Trump is a great relationship, and Abe has done a very good job, which is also kind of confusing for somebody who lives so far away in Sweden, because I understood that the point of going to the White House and violating the understanding that you don't visit the United States and visit somebody who isn't yet the president while the president is still there, I thought the point of that trip was to save the TPP and keep America in the TPP, but America left the TPP despite Abe prostrating himself. So, but somehow he still manages to be depicted as this successful, strong national security leader who formed a good relationship with Abe or with Trump. So it's just another point, I suppose. The other thing is Abe is strong for Japan. He's protecting Japan. He's strong on national security. He's calling for increased pressure on North Korea. And Trump is actually considering a strike. And it was just last week, Victor Cha, a well-renowned scholar and analyst and government official who was supposed to be ambassador to South Korea, he was just about set to go, was pulled out because he had written that the United States shouldn't consider any sort of strikes on North Korea. So he was removed by the Trump administration because of his position on limited strikes on North Korea. So it's not the case that it is the case that Trump is genuinely, as far as we can tell, genuinely considering what would be such a catastrophic move as a strike. So Abe, who has a good relationship with Trump, is jumping up and down for increased pressure on North Korea, which could actually lead to a strike, which would actually threaten Japan, which would actually cause a crisis under any kind of definition, and which would actually undermine Japan's security. So it's very confusing anyway, just to some initial thoughts, how it is that Abe has managed to get himself into this position where both in US mainstream narratives and in Japanese mainstream narratives, he is this wonderful leader who has a great relationship with Trump and is really tough on national security and is protecting Japan. Very strange. But back to crises anyway. So yeah, many crises have been used to get Japan to this point, and I think some of the people tomorrow will be talking about how North Korea has been used. I guess I'll be talking a little bit about not how crises were used to get Japan to this point, but how crises were used to prevent Japan from deviating from this point, because I'll be talking about the Democratic Party of Japan and their foreign policy, which, according to mainstream narratives, just lurched from one crisis to another. That is to say that it started with the Futenma fiasco, the Futenma debacle. It moved on to Cannes' handling of the Chinese collision incident, the trawler collision incident, you might remember, which was mishandled in the standard narrative. And then Noda, who was in charge during the island purchase. If you remember, Ishihara was going to buy the islands. And interestingly, Hatoyama gets hammered, Kan gets hammered, but Noda comes out quite, he gets some criticism, but the general story is what he did the best he could in a difficult situation, which is interesting because the only one who actually could have done otherwise was probably Noda, and he made certain decisions which definitely made the situation worse. And the outcome, the fallout from that island purchase was the deep freeze of Sino-Japanese relations, the militarization of the dispute of the islands, but somehow because he's a bit of a hawk and he's a bit conservative, he's okay. So that's kind of the general story I'll be saying tomorrow. The last thing I want to say is just to talk to something that Hiroko said about Colin Hay in the 1970s in the UK. And it's the question maybe for all of us, and especially for you two guys, are all these different narratives that we're going to hear, these different issue narratives, social narratives, issues or narratives of social crisis, of political crisis, of international relations crisis, can they be woven into a single coherent meta-narrative? Or maybe it's more of a question, can Abe do it? Because if he can, then he can transform the state, right? That's what Hay says. Because like for Thatcher, as much as Hay points out that there was a meta-narrative, and I'm not British, nor was I alive in the 1970s, but I'm a bit post-colonial because I'm Irish, so it's kind of, there's a collective memory of the winter of discontent, even with us. And my collective memory tells me that there was a general strike, the graveyards were closed, the hospitals were closed, the garbage wasn't collected. So there was some, we haven't seen that in Japan as of yet. So there's maybe not as much to work with as of yet. So it'll be interesting, how do we adjust the theory to fit the Japanese case, or what does the Japanese case say? That's interesting. I've talked much longer than I planned, sorry.
So thank you very much. This was a thought-provoking first round, I suppose. I guess I've collected a couple of points. So Professor Takeda said moral panic in Japan. However, moral panic's been caused for the purpose of conserving the status quo. So that's a bit of a contradiction here. Then we've got Professor Hasegawa saying, well, no political crisis, actually. Abe is very successful if it comes to his political legacy. And if there is, there's a hidden crisis. And the paradox is that Japan's youth is much more conservative than the older generation. And so maybe there's potential for a crisis here. David Chiaraki made a wonderful point also in terms of inequality and the crisis of sociology. Brings the science of knowledge here. So we go back to this. And I think the last point is the possibility for a meta-narrative. And is Abe able to actually facilitate the construction of this meta-narrative? I'll have an answer to this later on, but I'll provide it after we open up the round for questions or comments. So this is a round table. So if you just imagine a circle here, you're all included, and my colleague Chris, he'll make sure that the debate stays in the boundaries of our two seats here. So you're also welcome to use the microphone if you have anything to say.
Just a small remark. I was quite impressed to hear this kind of see the varieties in how people interpret the question or answer the question of whether there is a crisis or not, not just from the different perspectives, but also in terms of what crisis as a term or a concept means. And I just would wonder whether we could, in answering or kind of linking up to the points that the panelists made, whether we could come closer to some sort of an common understanding of what crisis is in the conceptual sense or the academic sense, as opposed to something else, let's say problems. Anyway, the floor is open.
I'm not a political scientist. I'm also a sociologist, but I also studied computer science. So I would be interested in, so Abe is making a lot of use of the term crisis, national crisis. So how about former prime ministers of Japan? So where, as Hiroko said, like it was also formally in the system. And as you just said, like Japan always has a crisis. So is there kind of different national crisis now? And Abe is making also this link to digitalization, as every country is doing it. And how much has digitalization is connected to a crisis of sociology, because most sociologists don't know much about IT and IoT. So then it's a kind of like how you look at the system, how you analyze the system. If you, and also now in Germany, we have Industry 4.0, and like who will stay connected to Industry 4.0 and who will not? So this is also kind of where you have to learn new skills in this kind of changing systems and changing whatever. And David, you said like, okay, also in Germany, there's a kind of feeling of inequality and people might get lost, but is it easy to compare it to Japan in a way? Is there a sense of similar crisis all over? And goes this narrative back in the history to other maybe former? So Merkel always says, like, okay, we can do it. So there's no crisis. So how about seeing it or putting it in perspective, in historical perspective, and then do we have a kind of acceleration of narratives of crisis because of the connection to digitalization and all these ongoing things? That's my question.
Yeah, it's not super connected. Oh, thank you. I've got a very loud voice. I think everyone will probably be able to hear. Yeah, that's not really super connected, but do you want me to try and connect that? Thank you so much. I am making an effort. Yeah. I mean, okay. Well, I'll do my best. I mean, in terms of connecting the idea of a meta-narrative, right, which all of these things seem to be looking at. I mean, one area, and this goes with digitalization, I guess, to make the connection, is that from a political point of view, digitalization included, maybe even at a very large stretch, we could even reach to the security sphere. It would be more difficult. I'll go tomorrow. But generally speaking, I think we've got to look at the idea of neoliberalism or neoliberal agenda within this, because all of these things fall within some kind of, they're all either an attack on neoliberal reforms, or they are seen as the result of neoliberal reforms, or they're a response to neoliberal reforms or neoliberal policy initiatives, right? So in terms of weaving together these different kind of social and political ideas, I think to miss out neoliberalism would probably be a mistake. So we've got to kind of address that somehow. And then that goes with this idea, I think that Paul was kind of touching on, where you've got the, sort of a whole range of different crisis issues, some of which actually appear to be very material or potentially very material, others of which are clearly just a narrative created for the purpose of warping policy, if you like. And I am British and was just about alive in the 1970s. And sadly, I don't remember the food queues or maybe luckily, I don't remember the food queues and the strikes, but certainly talking to my parents, that's an example where they would argue that it was a real crisis. Certainly my mum and dad both talk about it as, no, this was something real. This was not a great thing. It was very, we were discontented, living in that environment. And similarly, as Paul's pointing out, in the case of North Korea, this is one of the most obvious and kind of simple ideas to pick up on in terms of a narrative creative, right? Which I think is why I've been assigned this task. But on the other hand, there is a set of escalations which could take place, which would take us into a very real crisis. So, whilst weaving this meta-narrative together, we've also got to, I think, pick out the material and then if you like, the socially constructed. That's it.
We've kind of been talking so far about us weaving the narrative together, or the meta-narrative together. I don't think we're the ones who are doing it, right? I mean, we're talking about Abe, or the government of Japan, weaving the narrative together, and I think that's something that we could be focusing on, like how much each of our issue areas are affecting one another, or how much each of our issue areas are brought to bear on one another. And I was thinking that when I was listening to Hiroko's presentation about gender, that there are gender narratives and things that are brought by the government in things like, for example, constitutional reform, right? In that the government itself has been presenting in its popular culture on constitutional reform. One of the things that the government used to advertise constitutional reform, or a couple of them actually, were manga and anime. And there was sort of a narrative of a traditional Japanese family that was supposed to represent Japanese values, having this big discussion about constitutional issues in a very, very sexist way. So I don't really know where I'm going here. I think the point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that we should really be focusing on the LDP weaving together a story using these disparate threads that cross a whole load of different boundaries, like gender, like defense issues, and this is across the whole spectrum of its advertising on constitutional reform.
Thank you. Would someone send to pick some of the comments up?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I very much agree. So that's the question: as to what extent can the thread be drawn between these three? How are they linked discursively, or are they linked discursively? And I think that's going to be that's partly going to be your work, your work. So good luck with that. But obviously all of us have to do it. And the second thing is to go back to what you were saying, and to what Ra was saying about, I guess that we all, or I get a bit nervous talking in front of sociologists because they're so good at theory, and I'm not so strong on theory, but at least I know that the question of narratives, like the material and the ideational, like what's just a failure, what's just when does it become a crisis, and what's the difference, like, between it being felt as a crisis, it being under, like, this is something we're going to have to, I guess, make sure that we all have some kind of understanding of, a shared understanding of, because also Colin Hay, I mean, he's definitely not a post-structuralist, right? He says, there's these failures, but they don't necessarily turn into crisis narratives. Work is done. So maybe you could say some things about it. Yeah, no, okay.
Okay, maybe taking up, I think we had a point of digitalization and neoliberalism, just a few words to that. I think digitalization obviously is part of this kind of discourse or narrative of rising inequality, and one main factor often said is the technological transformation going on. Many people would argue that this is the main factor why we have rising income inequality, because some people have more skills for the new economy and some people don't. And some people don't have these skills, these jobs are just getting obsolete. And of course, then is the discourse, what will happen in the future? Will this go on? Will this get even more severe? Will this even treat more jobs, etc.? I guess we all in academics feel kind of safe. But obviously, I guess everybody of us once has thought, maybe one day, not me, but a robot that could sit here and write the paper. You know, just having enough good informatic and programming, maybe he could write better papers than I do. So what is then left for us to do? So maybe then in the future a robot sits in discussing, and we just will be the ones listening to these great guys having much better ideas than us. But so this is really, I mean, obviously this is also connected to the crisis. Is always, I think, a narrative about a development in the past, what happens currently, but also what could happen in the future. That things could get bad. I mean, most probably one winter in England was not the bad story, but the thinking of people is, will this go on? We have to do something. We have to change something. This can't go on like this, so to say. So there is maybe also the connection to digitalization. And then obviously neoliberalism, yes, I think this is an important topic surely in the tomorrow. The idea, I would say obviously Japan had for a long time this idea of shared growth, which was also in some way a liberal economic system, but not only, so to say, but it was a bit a small welfare state, with fast growth and a kind of a transformation of this growth in everyday life for people. Then came the idea of neoliberal structural reforms, increased actually, I would argue, really the debate on inequality. I mean, it was a little bit similar what Hasegawa-sensei said. In 2005, the young people voted for Koizumi, for the structural reforms. And immediately after the elections, a discussion started. Why did the young people vote for the guy who destroys their future, so to say? Very simplified said. And of course, the point there was this discussion was not only from, let's say, the progressive opposition, but also from inside the LDP. There really where the whole debate on social inequality in Japan, the Kakuza Shakai, became a political debate, let's say, and then kind of opened up the opportunity for the DPJ to move in there, I will basically argue. And I would say the beauty somehow, if you want, with Abenomics is to do maybe neoliberal structural reforms, but to hide them. You know, there are three arrows, but we all speak about the first one, the finance side. There is the structural reform, the third arrow, but yeah, it's somewhere hidden in there. And there is even now the Abenomics 2.0, which kind of sums up the first three and then brings in welfare policy. Even, I mean, it looks like social democratic welfare policy, what Abe is doing. Again, very creative conservatism, you have to a certain point. Obviously, we are very skeptical if this will be really the big reforms and transformation of the welfare state maybe needed to really increase, for example, birth rates in Japan, because this would mean to really change the system and put a lot of money in there. And I'm even not sure that they're going to do that. But that's maybe the beauty of Abenomics. It's kind of neoliberalism hidden. And I would even say in Japan currently that there is no neoliberal, you can't win elections with a neoliberal agenda. Even Kibo no To, which most probably is more neoliberal than the LDP under Abe, they didn't really stress this point in the whole election campaign. They somehow also tried to hide it. And they had also some kind of, well, we could call it innovative also policies like this, you know, basic income, which is surprising coming from a party if it would really be a neoliberal party, let's say. Okay.
David just referred to former Prime Minister Koizumi. So I'm very interesting. In these 30 years, just Heisei era, who are most successful prime minister? Yeah, maybe Koizumi and Shinzo Abe, because both ran their cabinet more than 5 years, yeah. And both are very good at using narratives of crisis and connecting crisis and reform. Yeah. So I'd like to answer your question. So other former prime minister in Japan do not did not so stress crisis because LDP has been keeping long years ruling party. But only both Koizumi and Abe, they are good at narratives of using, in case of Shinzo Abe, constitutional reform and national security crisis, called in Japanese, kokunan. So security crisis election. He called last October's general election. And also Koizumi using some financial crisis, and David referred just Yusei Kaikaku, reform of mailing system, post office system. So we should be paying attention the relationship crisis and some kind of reform.
I'm actually sort of thinking about what Iris asked, like a kind of a crisis in a historical perspective, and I think like one sort of immediate example here is actually sort of like a period after the Second World War, and that was national crisis. And kokunan, national crisis, was also the word used, right? And so, and like I mean, many actually sort of political scholars in Japan sort of have discussed sort of Abe government sort of way of behavior tend to actually kind of incur sort of feeling, or basically they making reference to the basically that situation, like a kind of a difficult situation after the World War II. So, for example, like current sort of economic struggle is called third national sort of disaster, third, like a 第三の敗戦, so lost in the war, right? So that's one sort of reference point. So, like an analogy between current situation and the situation after the Second World War, kind of biggest sort of, like a disaster happened in the modern Japanese history. And then, so that's one side. And the other side, thinking about kind of a golden age of post-war period is actually that the 50s, 60s, like Japan's middle class having a kind of prosperous life, and that's already gone. Already, I mean, the demographic change, like equality issues, but nostalgia, like a feeling of nostalgia is there. Right? And, partly sort of responding to you, the moral panic is there to incur feeling of nostalgia, right? So that's how sort of, like, so we should go back to golden age. And that, like a link to the sort of, your point of constitutional reform, because, different sort of, like policy areas and the economic, like industrial sort of policies, that's pretty much sort of neoliberal, like a situation going on. Deregulation of labor force and stuff. But family there is a kind of a different type of policy area where basically kind of nostalgia and conservativeness can be endorsed and can be basically they can stay, and they actually stay to sort of like let's say, like exist as more like a cornerstone of Japanese society. And that kind of, discourse, we can find that kind of discourse in the 1980s, 1970s, family life, that's very important. That, not traditional, conventional standard family life is a cornerstone of Japanese society. We should protect there. Now, family life maybe get deteriorated, therefore, basically, we need to go back there. So that kind. We shouldn't forget neoliberal reform is always coupled with strong, kind of urging, like a drive for the basically the conservative, normative values, right? So I think what's going to, partly I think we can understand in this way.
Thank you very much. As empowers of my moderating power I'll use. There's one question I'd like to Professor Kiaraki. When you've talked about the Kaksa Shakai narrative, and I wonder under Abenomics, I think it was in his Abenomics 2.0, when he was promoting the concept of Ichioku Soukatsu Shakai. What's called? Ichioku Soukatsu, Soukatsu Shakai, that's called, right? I wonder, is that meant as a counter narrative for the Kaksa Shakai narrative? How do you see the relationship between those two? Or in general, were there attempts to counter this narrative of Kaksa Shakai in general under Abenomics? Because this is certainly undermining his agenda of growth. And so, how do you see this particular concept?
Well, generally said, I think the Abenomics kind of is the promise to bring back growth in a midterm at least, and the sustainable growth. But is even one more promise in there, of course, to bring back shared growth. So the main issue, in my point of view, of Abenomics is it just doesn't have only to bring back growth, because we had already growth during the Koizumi era. And I think this was maybe the structural factor who led to the politicization of social inequality that we can see there in the data. We have a return to 2% growth over several years. We have quite a long growth cycle. But what happened at the time is that this growth was concentrated in the urban Japan, not in the rural areas. And this is a huge contrast to what we had up to the 1990s in Japan, where growth was also kind of spilling over into the countryside. And this is then one main factor why the LDP loses 2007-9 in the countryside. That's where you lose your elections in Japan. You need to win the countryside. LDP always won the countryside. They suddenly lose it 2007-9 because the countryside is kind of disconnected from growth. So what Abenomics needs is kind of, or what he needs to achieve is not only growth, I think that to a certain point he has achieved, but he needs to achieve shared growth, which means people need to feel that they are connected to the growth in their everyday life, which basically I would say most probably the most simple and best indicator is, are salaries rising or not? And that hasn't happened up to now, really. I think Abe is well aware of this. I mean, there's this debate. He's very also doing policies surprising for conservative and during the spring offensive. He's always taking kind of some we even call it governmental spring offensive, because he's always saying employers should raise salaries. Now he's even saying this spring 3% is our goal. So the government is saying, like a labor union, we want 3% to the employers. But I think this is because he's aware he needs the rise of salary to kind of achieve this fundamental goal of shared growth. And then if the cake is getting bigger and everybody gets a bigger piece of the cake, the question of the distribution of the cake becomes secondary. And that's what actually was in the old general middle class model before. The cake got bigger and bigger. Everybody got always a bigger piece of the cake. So I didn't care too much if, Hasegawa-sensei gets a little bit more than me and his salary is increasing more than mine. We're both better off. So then we have shared growth, so to say. That we didn't achieve during the Koizumi era and with the neoliberal reforms. And we didn't achieve also up to now with Abenomics. And I think that's the huge kind of litmus test, if it is successful or not, and if we can overcome this story of social inequality or not.
Thank you. Obviously, it's hard to come to a common understanding of what crisis we're talking about, but I think the kind of discussion comes a bit more or converges, and we can leave the question of definition aside for a moment, and really probably could say that we agree that according to the government, at least, certainly the Koizumi and other governments, as Professor Hasegawa mentioned, there is a crisis. So, and people have also started to talk about what exactly these crises are, why these understandings of crisis emerged, what kind of socioeconomic developments, political developments have pushed this crisis, and the issue of neoliberalism or neoliberal reforms has been raised. So I just wondered whether in the next round we could focus a bit more on the actual changes, institutional changes that these crisis narratives have brought about, let's say since the Koizumi era. So just try to be a bit more precise in terms of explaining what you think has changed in terms of institutions, formal and informal, in your area. So I think it would be nice to move a bit more from the sociological perspective to the political science side of, or the political science side of sociology, if I may. So, is that a compromise? Anybody?
Yeah. How about actual institutional change happen? Yeah, this is very critical, important question. Yeah, and for example, nuclear energy. Yeah. Last January, Taiwan's Prime Minister Tsai, yeah, and her party passed the new law. The target is 2025. Yeah. The goal is denuclearization. And Taiwan's situation is very severe because maybe almost 20% of electricity is supplied by nuclear. Maybe 4 or 6 nuclear power plants. And Taiwan, no oil resources. Yeah. And very small, relatively small percentage of renewable energy resources now. Yeah. But they decided. And last June, new Korean president, President Moon, declared to change a nuclear energy policy. Yeah. So in next 40 years, Korean government also try to denuclearization. Also, Korean situation is very tough. Maybe 30% of electricity is supplied by nuclear energy. But both cases, new president showed their leadership to real institutional change of energy policy. Yeah, they is trying to learn from Fukushima nuclear accident. But what happened in Japan? Yeah. DPJ cabinet at the time, 2012, they started new regulatory committee, 原子力規制委員会, nuclear regulatory agency. But yeah, I admit new nuclear regulatory agency is trying to perform to more rigid regulatory policy. But and even now, almost 7 years later from Fukushima nuclear accident, only 5 nuclear plant is reopening. Yeah. So, but Japanese energy policy not so drastic changed. It remains almost almost same. Yeah. Before the Fukushima accident. So so Abe cabinet tried to change something, but Professor Takeda, what are main institutional change under Abe cabinet? Can you mention?
I mean, I very much agree with you. Basically, I've been sort of arguing that the Abe government, there is a big gap between the rhetoric and actually sort of component of policies proposed, implemented by Abe government. But try to sort of limit my discussion here in a sort of women's policy for the sake of this discussion. So women's policy, gender policy has been sort of highlighted by Abe government since 2014, and that was actually a big component of what you said, all citizens dynamic initiative, whatever, Ichiokuso Katsuyaku, big policy program. And it seems, like a government has been doing something, like a several sort of bill were proposed, like a diet pasta bills and stuff. But looking at it, actually, sort of a policy change has been, let's say, incremental, very gradual, not transformative. And like very interestingly, we can very easily find a lot of actually problem and deficiency, resulting from basically the lack of policy expertise, particularly in women's policy. And like at this moment, I think one of the big issue is to introduce the principle of equal pay for equal work, and to reduce the working hours. And if it can be realized, this is really transformative, big institutional change. But when we look at actually something proposed, like by government, for example, like equal pay for equal work, there's a guidelines already published in Ministry of Health, Labor, the Health, Labor, welfare website, but like kind of now on the surface, it is called, now Japan is going to introduce European type of labor regulation in terms of equal pay for equal work. But what's going on is actually the guideline recognize, basically justifies pay difference resulting from the different employment status. So it's nothing, right? So so the big kind of kind of performance let's say, of institutional reform. But we really need to look at what actually kind of proposed and implemented by government, and in many cases, particularly in a women's policy, changes very little. So I think that's something I have been sort of observing.
Thank you. So if Abe is performing institutional reform in other areas and trying to generate political capital, then there is one area that we all know that he is engaging in institutional reform, and that's maybe the only area he cares about. I'm not sure he's so interested in gender issues, but he is interested in the constitution and historical issues and in foreign policy.
He's interested in sort of keeping, maintaining past,
Exactly. And he learned his lesson from his first time in office when he pursued revisionist issues instead of making it look at least that he was interested in social and economic issues. And talking about narratives, I mean, that's the narrative of Abe, right? That he learned his lesson from his first term where he was criticized for caring about issues that the population wasn't interested in. So this time he came in and he didn't focus on national security at the beginning. He didn't focus on historical revisionism at the beginning. He talked about womenomics and these kind of softer, for him, issues to generate political capital so that he could introduce collective self-defense and those kind of things he's really interested in.
You can get both the microphone.
I know you want to move to the institutional reforms or change, but also regarding Professor Hasegawa, and in a former life I studied social movements and religious movements. And in Japan, they are very strong. So 1/3 of the Japanese population is member in one or the other new religious movement. And like when we had Ohm, the Ohm gas attack, it was a very aggressive sign to the Japanese government. We have a crisis. We don't agree with what you're doing. We would like to participate in kind of making decisions. And Ohm wanted to kind of set up their own government within the Japanese government. And you said like there's nothing changed in regard to nuclear and Abe's energy, but only 5 nuclear power plants are now running. And I think the social movement, whatever you want to call it, is very strong in that sense. And if they continue to be very strong, I think there has to be also an institutional reform, in a way. In what way? So this kind of, I think now we talk about a politician level and how politicians act and how institutional reform is kind of done or not done. But how about the kind of civil society power? How do they perceive? It's maybe connected to inequality and equality, but how do they perceive crisis, and how do they try to achieve institutional reforms and change?
Thank you for your very excellent question. Yeah. What are roles of social movement? I think social movement urge to institutional reform to keep human rights and etc. So the role of protecting something and another, simply speaking, another role is developing some kind of opportunity, as Professor Takeda stressed, opportunity for women. So, Japanese social movement successful to protect something. For example, you mentioned, I mentioned keeping reopening nuclear power plant only 5. This is just a good evidence of some kind successful of anti-nuclear movement, especially after Fukushima accident. But how about developing human rights or something by a invented new institutional reform or new institutional policy. And one of the big real crisis of coming Japanese society is decreasing population and big debt, financial crisis. But in case of Abe cabinet, how about family policy? And how about population policy? Almost maybe nothing.
That raises a different sort of problem, because now increasingly since 2014, policy. So some, on the one hand, of course, this sort of, the policy to promote women's labor or promote women sort of going on, and sort of, like women getting sort of told they have to shine in Japanese society. That's anyway. But on the other hand, what's going on is actually it's not easy to see, but there are series of policies who basically try to sort of, like push women to more like, like getting married and having babies. So, like as a national sort of, like education program, now sort of emphasizing sort of biological limit of women's body to have babies. That's sort of compulsory. And then, in education, school education. And then also, like a local sort of government sort of promoting sort of marriage agency to sort of, make matching between the men and the women to get married. And, like also sort of, like now government sort of try to give a tax break for, like third generation cohabitation families. So all those, like those sort of, policies, so, combining, basically to sort of endorse the very sort of conventional, 50 to 60 type standard family model. And, like basically emphasizing the importance of, like a traditional Japanese sort of family culture. So that's, it's happening, and I say this is quite a sort of radical, given that actually, sorry, I forgot one more thing, because now national government has numerical target of, total fertility rate to be achieved by 2020. And the total fertility rate, that's actually sort of, like a significant number of women, number of children women have. So that's actually quite a direct message to young women to have a baby to this number, right? So it's a very strong sort of initiative going on. So and this is quite radical, given that the Japanese government sort of have sort of restrained itself from like doing that kind of aggressive pronatal policy for a long time. So radical change is happening, but I'm not sure it is called institutional change.
So we see the Abe government will be very busy until 2020. We have got constitutional revision. It's being called the target until 2020. Fertility rate also 2020. So Japan will be busy. I think Dave, you had a question, some comments.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a little bit different from the institutional question that Kristen raised, but I really enjoyed the panel and learned a great deal. I'm wondering, to go back to the earlier question of what a crisis is, it seems that in some ways the sort of bigger terminological issue might be what a narrative is. This is actually something that Professor Kiyosaki mentioned in his paper, that at one point I think you say something like, whether this is a narrative or a topic or a theme, I can't remember, but I thought it was a very, very good point, right? It's what do we call these things? Because if we think of narratives as actually being stories, and actually having stories that imply not just a past that is told in the present and a future that's projected in the present, partly what that drives is a sort of a desire for the resolution that climax is going to create. And that's the contract that an author has with his or her readers, or that a filmmaker has with his or her audience, or so forth. And it seems to me that if one thinks about it, that I'm not trying to just preview my talk tomorrow too much, but I mean, if you think about it in that sense, at least one possible implication is that the crisis itself is produced when a narrative goes off the rails, and that the crises that we're talking about now may not be linked in any direct sense in terms of their individual motifs, but rather in the way in which they don't fit into the country that Japan was supposed to become, the Japan as number one, or the Japan that was going to keep growing eternally, and so forth. And we see this narrative all the time, right? Just watch Asadora any morning of the week, and you'll see a version of this being presented, or the Old Sancho no Yuhi movies that sort of create this nostalgic image of a country that was once together, that worked together to build a better future, a better, more peaceful future. And yet somehow that's not the country we have anymore. This, in fact, I think Professor Takeda's points, I think, are very, very precise in this regard, that there's this romanticized construction of what Japanese family life used to be. It was never like that. It was never the way it was supposed to have been. But still, there's this image that it must have been like that, and somehow things have gone off the rails, that families aren't like that anymore. And so it occurs to me that maybe one way to think about this would be to try to think about how the crises themselves are produced by a sort of a constantly reproduced story of Japan that never really caught what Japan was, but that what we've achieved today, what Japan is today, is not what the future Japan was supposed to have been a few years ago. This is not just a conservative message, right? I mean, to go back to Professor Hasegawa's very interesting points, when you mentioned your students sort of filling in their answers and they're all pro-Abe and conservative, I mean, yeah, I get this all the time and it drives me bonkers. But I imagine that as mysteries go, this isn't really like the X-Files or anything. It's not like crazy that this would be happening. But it does feel like something of a betrayal, right? It's not what was supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen was that our younger generations were supposed to be leading towards a more progressive, a more just, a more equitable, a more peaceful future. And they're not. And that's a source of great disappointment, and it's a source of great anxiety. And to the extent that you feel it as a crisis, I share that feeling. So it's not a criticism. It's simply an observation that the way in which we've been taught to think about certain stories and how our country is supposed to develop can actually produce a certain feeling of crisis when it turns out that the world we've reached, an imperfect, messed up world with great vulnerabilities, isn't what we thought we were going to get. Anyway, but I really enjoyed the talks.
there's someone in the panel who would like to respond to the comment.
Yeah. Yeah. Why younger generation is so conservative? Yeah. In my impression, yeah, several reasons maybe. In a Japanese situation, I'm just 63 years old. My generation, basic framework of political thinking is just at the time, yeah, political socialization at my younger age, the power of socialism is so strong in Japanese context. And pacifism is also strong. But in these days, younger generation, they already lost such a political framing. I'm not sure their political framework. Liberalism, yeah. In Japanese context, maybe liberalism lost some value. Only, yeah, stressing right, human right, yeah. This is important, but very nominal. So, yeah, democratic, yeah, of course, but students cannot realize real meaning of democracy. In case of Taiwan and South Korea, social movement even now very strong. Like 2016 November and December's anti-park president protest. Yeah, I just watched in Seoul. Yeah. Saturday, next Saturday, and next Saturday, yeah. The number of protesters is drastically increasing. I did not watch such in Japan. Yeah, maybe in Taiwan and in South Korea, just political change happened in late 80s. So change to democratic reform happened in 1980s. So 50s and early 60s, yeah, they are keeping very keen memory how we protested the government at the time. But in Japan, yeah, late 60s, they were protests, student protest in 1968, 69. Yeah. But the number of protesters not so huge as global standard. So in any survey, the ratio of having demonstrate is only 5% in world value survey in Japan. So so current younger generation showed a kind of a political attitude. So in Japanese family, typically parents do not talk to their children on political issues. In the US, yeah, presidential election is a very good topics of daily conversation, especially presidential election here. But in Japan, in family, they do not talk on politics. And even university professors do not talk politics, even during general elections. Yeah, very few. And such professors may be supporters of JCP, Japanese Communist Party, maybe. Yeah. So it's a kind of socialization of being a political. So such a political generation is supporting current situation. So they did not so realize we are conservative, but in fact, their attitude is just conservative. It's a kind of another paradox, maybe. So, 自覚せざるコンサバティブ。なんて言ったらいいかな。だから、ね、その意識してるコンサバティブは、for example, そうそう。Yeah, in case of net Uyo, in case of net conservative, yeah, they have some kind of consciousness. Yeah. But general young people, they did not realize I am conservative. This might be real crisis.
We have to add the crisis of democracy to our list. The crisis of civil society and democracy in general, I suppose. There's one question I would like to ask David, because since we have a specialist on immigration here, I mean, immigration policy seems, at least in my view, looking at Japan's sort of workforce population, inevitable. So I wonder how this fits into, I mean, we have got this immigration policy discourse, and then we have got this very conservative value agenda that focuses on Japan as being a homogeneous nation, as being a very powerful narrative over many, many years in Japan, decades. So I wonder how this will develop in the future. Where do you see Japan going when in terms of Japan's immigration policy?
Well, basically, my point is always to say, first of all, Japan today is an immigration country. And it is an immigration country since the late 1980s. Not many people, politicians, acknowledge that, but it is. The share of foreign population is still below 2%, but it has more than doubled since the late 1980s. And if you look at the number of net inflow of new foreign residents to Japan, Japan is in the top 10 of the OECD countries. So there is a significant inflow. This will continue independent if you have big reforms or not. And of course, we see for years now incremental reforms, not the big reforms happening. And this is based, it's let's say, more opening, most probably leading to more immigration coming in. So this will go on and it will increase. Of course, you could do a big reform, but it's unexpectable, let's say. I don't think that's going to happen. And it's not just Japan. All advanced industrial societies have huge problems if they want to try to do an immigration reform. Look at the United States, look at the European countries, etc. You see them in it all. It's because immigration policy obviously leads also to this kind of strange bedfellows coalitions that all of a sudden the left wing is with a very conservative nationalistic group against immigration, and then maybe some part of the more human rights interested upper, let's say, progressive political side is all of a sudden with the employers who want more foreign labor, so more open for immigration. If we go to this conservative the discourse, let's say, of Japan as a homogeneous society, it's interesting to note that this discourse played a role in the policy making inside of the LDP. But it was not the really driving force in the anti-immigration discourse in public. We have since the late 1990s basically started a debate on more immigration because of the demographic development. Actually, we had that already around 1990 when we had the first debate, but since the late 1990s we have that. The big argument against more immigration at the time was another crisis of public security. So rising criminality, less public security. We can really say there we had a moral panic. We had also another way how the statistic was done. So if you look at the statistics, you have a huge increase in crimes, but it's because the statistics have been done differently. And we have other surveys which show that we have some increase in crime, so less public security, which we expect with the economic downturn, but not as much as is this huge discourse we had on public crime and public insecurity at the time. And this one factor identified for the increase of crime and the rise of public insecurity was more foreign residents, foreign criminals. And we could even point more specifically in many medias, Chinese immigrants was the main culprits of this development. And this was, of course, the main contra-discourse or contra-narrative, why Japan shall not allow more immigrants, because it would lead to an increase of the public security crisis, so to say. So you see, you could say in this policy field, interesting was you had two huge crisis discourses. One side saying, if Japan doesn't open up, it will disappear. It will die out. The population is, we need more immigrants for staying a big country, a country who counts something in the world. It's not about being number 3. It's about being in the top 10, so to say. And on the other side, you had another course who said, if Japan opens more up and has more immigrants, this will lead to a complete disaster in public security, rise of crime. We had also at the time the French banlieue, which was a huge argument and taking up, this is the future of Japan if we have more immigrants. A society marked by segregation, a society marked by public insecurity, etc. Interestingly, I think in recent years, the public security discourse is somehow going down. Moral panics also start to disappear. They're not only, they kind of, so there's kind of an opening which could lead to kind of a chance for having more, or let's say for doing more comprehensive reforms. However, again, I think the chances for that are rather small. We also need to say, for example, DPJ, they had quite big reforms in mind until they came into power. Then they were, of course, busy with other things, but immigration policy was not in the first line. What we know recently under Abe, there were really discussions on the top level in the government about doing a big reform. Finally, it was declined. What they do now is kind of small reforms on the existing foreign trainee programs, etc. However, I think these small reforms could lead to much more immigration in the future. So we have incremental reforms, however, which have a potential of rising immigration much more. And what I see especially not, and what nobody proposed, is to kind of really turn back, to stop immigration. Because then really you would have workforce who is missing, let's say. So the Japanese economy is already depending on foreign workers, especially in the sector of services. I mean, you most probably notice if you go in Japan, in some areas in the night, in the convenience store, they're all non-Japanese, so to say. So the convenience stores don't function anymore, at least in some cities in Japan. But what is also point, it's also the, for example, the export industry. So the very famous companies and brands we know, they can produce in Japan today, not because they themselves are hiring foreign workers, but because the suppliers of the suppliers of the suppliers in the supplier chain are hiring foreign workers and are really important, small but very important part of this whole production. And so Japan is a production side. So you see, that's why you can't turn this back, so a certain way here. So overall, you could even say maybe immigration was up to now very pragmatic. It's officially very kind of a system which is not very open, but has some open side doors, and is very functional up to now, how it functioned.
Yeah, just very, very briefly. But the official story is right that these crises can be solved not by immigration, but the labor crisis or labor shortage and the elderly care crisis be solved. I told you the other day by robots. That's where the money goes. That's what the official story is. Exactly.
I just want to go back to this notion of non-conviction conservatives, or however you want to translate this. I think it's an interesting point to make. I don't think it's restricted to Japan. I mean, and you mentioned the nettoyu. There have been studies done on the alt-right, I think, in the US, where they've looked at what kind of unites the alt-right, where they come together, and they've found, and I can't remember the paper, but they've found, whoever wrote the paper, that the alt-right isn't really a coherent force with a complete platform of grievances. They all have different grievances, what they share as a forum, and you might see that that's the same thing as the nettoyu. And why I'm talking about this is because I want to link it back to the issue or to the notion of crisis. When we talk about crisis, we have been using Hayes' framing of the term. I wonder if it's something different, though. I wonder if what we have is a general apathy in Japanese politics, and you can explain that apathy in a number of ways. We could explain it through neoliberalism, and that people are focused on their own concerns rather than the concerns of the nation. The grand narrative is dying down, if you like. Or we could explain it in terms of just the sheer sort of media assault on people. And, people are no longer all watching NHK or all reading one of the national newspapers to get their news or whatever. So there's no sort of national story they're focused on. I mean, however you explain it, I wonder if crisis works as a kind of useful tool for politicians to scream above the noise, or above the kind of, or just to get people interested and motivated in politics, their political issues. Not in the way that we've been talking about, not in the way of demonizing another or creating a story that seems attractive to people. And therefore, I wonder if there's a risk for politicians like Abe, in that the sense of crisis that he is creating is going to create a backlash, or does create a backlash, once people do start thinking about politics. And they look at the story that Abe is telling and they say, well, I'm a sensible person who, you know, doesn't just agree with politicians. I know you're spinning a yarn here. I know you want to change the constitution and you're telling me this big story about North Korea or whatever, but really you have ulterior motives. And therefore, no, I'm not going to stand for this. And if we look at the security issues, which is what I focus on mostly, there hasn't been widespread popular support for things like, at least at the time they're implemented, for the big security issues that Abe is focused on, like collective self-defense, like the public security law. I don't think there was that much interest paid to the formation of the National Security Council, but that's probably because it wasn't something that the public were thinking of. And therefore there's a danger here, because there are certain things that Abe needs the public for. He needs the public for changing the constitution. And if you look at Abe's, or the LDP's original 2012 proposal for changing the constitution, it's a lot stronger than what he's proposing now, right? At least in terms of Article 9. So there is a danger in invoking a crisis narrative, because it does actually get people thinking about politics, not necessarily in the way that Abe would want them to think about it. Sorry if that's a bit provocative, given that we're meant to be going with hey, but there you go.
So I'm looking at the watch, and actually we are sharp on time. If I open up the panel for another round of responses, I think we go 10 minutes over time. I propose that we'll continue the conversation over dinner. We have 2 hours of extended dinner with good fish and Japanese cuisine. I think it's a good venue to continue the conversation. And I would like to discuss the point that was raised. What are the implications of the populist backlash of crisis narratives, if you may call it? You know, these may actually, the unintended effects of crisis narratives either, maybe something that we have to address tomorrow. So I, as moderator of this panel, thank all the panelists and our extended roundtable in the audience for the great conversation. I didn't anticipate that this was going so well, so if you have a good number of smart people in the room, something good comes out. So thank you all very much. And the dinner will start at 6:30, so you have 30 minutes to walk over the campus to get some refreshments. And I propose we go all together, maybe 10 minutes before 6. We meet at the first floor, and I'll take you. Yes, yeah, so 20 minutes after. So 10 minutes before half. So 6:20. 6:20, yeah, so 6:20. Please come to the first floor, and I'll take you to the restaurant. Okay? So thank you very much. And